be with you all virtually. It is unfortunately apologies for us not being there in person in Johannesburg. Please know that we are both there in spirit. First, a little bit of background. My name is Leland Lazarus. I'm the Associate Director for the Gordon Institute for Public Policy in Florida International University. That is a university that's based in Miami, Florida, here in the United States. And we focus on national security, international relations, and cybersecurity issues. And my focus has been largely on China's influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. And for a second year in a row, Florida International University, along with Paul and the Center for African Strategic Studies at National Defense University, we've put on what we call the Africa Americas Forum on China. This is where we convene 23 experts and over 100 participants from across Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean in order to compare and contrast how the People's Republic of China engages in both regions. And so we created this because we were already organically seeing this connection happening. Leaders from both regions were already reaching out to each other in order to share best practices or to share lessons learned. And so we thought it was important to create a platform and a space where we can bring together experts from both regions to talk about this. And so this year's theme was trans-regionalism, where we sought to identify and develop new frameworks and methodologies on how to study the PRC's engagement in the Global South and in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa in particular. Our partners included Howard University, the HBCU in DC, the Yale Institute of Advanced Study, Flaxo Argentina, the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, University of Pretoria, the U.S. International University in Kenya, the Africa Sino Center for International Relations, the Atlantic Council, Global China Hub, and the U.S. Institute of Peace. So it was truly a international effort. So now I'm just going to go quickly to summarize the different plenary sessions that we had, and I'll also make sure to share both virtually and hopefully Tara and Aihua can share the link to the summaries that we have in multiple languages, and then also the videos from the sessions that we had this year. But we started off with a opening plenary session, and that plenary session really dived deep into the frameworks for transregionalism. They identified the fact that if we're approaching the comparison of Chinese influence between both regions, but through the lens of area studies specifically, that limits the scholars' comprehensive understanding of China's influence. The panelists also encouraged Global South scholars to spend more significant time living in China, significant time being able to learn Mandarin and speak Chinese fluently in order to really understand the local viewpoints about China. And then also they encouraged more universities both in Africa and in Latin America and the Caribbean to establish Chinese studies and or Asian studies departments in order to train the next cadre of scholars and who truly understand the relationship. Then throughout the day, we separated ourselves into breakout sessions based on 6 themes: dealing with debt, securing supply chains and critical minerals, climate and the environment, security and law enforcement, emerging technology like AI, space, telecommunications and cybersecurity, and disinformation and media. And so I'm just going to go and handle the first 3, and then Paul will also summarize the second 3. In the dealing with debt session, we had Huang Yufan, who's a PhD candidate at Cornell University and Henry Tugendhat, who's the director for China at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And they were providing insights on Chinese lending trends, challenges, and the future of debt diplomacy in the region. Huang mentioned that in terms of China's debt strategies, they specifically rely on bilateral debt rescheduling rather than multilateral frameworks like the Paris Club. And while this approach offers diplomatic leverage, repeated bilateral rescheduling has led to financial losses and has raised concerns about its long-term viability. A unique challenge in China's lending practices is also its institutional fragmentation. Unlike the centralized debt management structures of G7 nations, China's banks operate with limited coordination, often handling negotiations independently, and this has led to inconsistencies in debt management. And they also compared that with, say, Japan's structured approach, which could offer lessons for China as it adapts its lending practices. In response to the perception that China's lending is predatory, the panelists argued that most Chinese loans are actually structured commercially with terms similar to those from other international lenders, but nonetheless, they both called for greater transparency for urging China to clarify its lending practices and enable a more balanced assessment of its role in global debt markets. And then lastly, the discussion concluded with an emphasis on understanding Africa and Latin America debt dynamics and the implications of China's debt strategies on these economies. If China refines its approach, learning from, say, the experience of Japan, it could contribute to a more stable financial environment for both African and Latin American countries. The second breakout session was on securing supply chains and critical minerals. And that had Christian Gerard Nima of the China Global South Project, as well as Dr. Juliana Gonzalez Jauregui of Flaxo, Argentina. And they talked about the need for both African and Latin American countries to align their understanding of critical minerals, which is also, of course, a crucial for technology like green energy transitions. Currently, both many African and Latin American and Caribbean countries lack a cohesive critical mineral strategy, with many countries not really controlling or profiting directly from their resources due to foreign ownership of the mining sector. This is exacerbated by China's dominance in minerals, especially lithium, with significant investments in Argentina and Chile, which serve as essential hubs for lithium production. In 2024, 65% of Argentina's lithium exports went to China, with Chinese state-owned enterprises gradually acquiring full ownership of these key projects. The conversation also touched on the technology's role in the critical mineral value chain. So, for example, artificial intelligence and big tech are seen as potential tools to streamline operations, though Christian Gerard Nima argued that Africa must position itself within the supply chain in order to benefit from the resources fully. Much of the added value processes still occur outside the region. And so there needs to be increased research and development funding in Africa and Latin America in order to help regions capture more value from their resources, potentially reducing reliance on foreign investments and enhancing technological autonomy. The session also underscored that African countries focus largely on extraction with limited initiatives to establish downstream initiatives in industries like battery manufacturing or AI-driven resource management. And so building an AI and tech sector in Africa and in Latin America would require substantial investment in R&D and could shift the region's role in global technological transitions. The third breakout session was on climate and environmental protection. And what was interesting was that, of course, there was a lot of overlap between that, and then also the supply chain and critical mineral section. For example, the demand for lithium from the lithium triangle, like in Latin America, so that's specifically Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, they have placed environmental pressures on indigenous lands in those countries, and of course, local communities. Another case is, of course, Peru, which has been in the spotlight over the past 2 weeks with hosting APEC and the rollout of the port of Chancay with 60% ownership of the Chinese state-owned enterprise Costco. But in Peru, there's often a conflict in environmental protection, but also making sure wanting to leverage extractive industries like its abundance of copper. African resources play a crucial role in the global energy transition, with over 50% of the world's critical mineral deposits located in Africa. And the panelists in that session recommended the following. First, both regions should advocate for revising the World Trade Organization regulations in order to support resource nationalism. They should also create regional mineral clusters, and they should shift extractive practices to more sustainable and beneficial models. Both regions should move from being a rule taker to a rule maker, and then also support artisanal and small scale mining operations, addressing double taxation, and should negotiate with developed countries for debt cancellation as a form of ecological reparations. And all those would help to enhance Africa and Latin America's autonomy in the global mineral markets. And lastly, both of them lifted up Chile from the Latin America side and Morocco from the Africa side as two successful case studies to date. These are, of course, two countries that have developed at least a framework for really making sure that critical minerals is part of their national security strategies. And both of them have stood up state-owned enterprises focused specifically on critical mineral production in order to make sure that those critical minerals are not fully owned and operated by foreign entities. So after that, Paul, I give the floor to you for the next three.
Thank you very much, Leland, and thank you, Aihoa, and to the organizers. Again, I would really want to apologize, to send my apologies for not being there in person, unfortunately. But nevertheless, I'm really honored and privileged to have been invited to participate in this meeting. And I'm looking forward to participating in person at the next edition, wherever that will be held. Leland, thank you very much for your kind introduction at the beginning. My name is Paul Nantulya. I work at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, which is it's located in the on the grounds of the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and part of the U.S. Department of Defense. It has really been a pleasure to work with Leland on this initiative. This Africa Americas Forum on China is a platform, as Leland mentioned, which tries to get experts, practitioners, professionals from the three regions, Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America, into closer interaction and engagement to review China's and Chinese, that is the People's Republic of China's engagements across these important regions in the global south. I think I'll just go back to the origins of it. Leland and I met at I believe it was 2 years ago, in Pennsylvania at the U.S. Army War College. U.S. Army War College organizes an annual conference on China's People's Liberation Army every year, bringing PLA scholars together to kind of review and to look at trends in China's military modernization and military engagement. And Leland and I were on two panels. So I was on the Africa panel, and Leland was on the Latin America panel. We, there was a lot of similarity in the patterns of Chinese engagements in both regions, and so we got together and we said, you know what, maybe we should try and make this more formalized, and to see if we can have a platform that can bring the two regions together. So I'm really excited. We had our first set of engagements in Orlando, and then the second set of engagements we had this year, which was virtual. But then some sessions were incorporated in a conference on African agency that was held in Nairobi that I attended in person. So, it absorbed it integrated some of the work that this forum has been doing. So again, I'm very, very excited about where the partnership is going. So the three sessions the remaining sessions, so the third session focused on security and law enforcement. And in this session, this panel basically looked at China's, or rather the People's Republic of China, since there's a difference between China and the People's Republic of China. So we looked at the People's Republic of China's security cooperation in both regions. And our colleague Alonso Ilueca from Universidad Santa Maria la Antigua in Panama gave a really comprehensive and intensive look at Chinese engagements in Panama, which have been increasing ever since Panama established ties with the People's Republic of China in 2017. It's been very rapid. Lots of security projects that the PRC has put in place, among which include a security and emergency operations center that is equipped with advanced surveillance technology, which is very similar to the technologies that are in use in Xinjiang and Shenzhen. And this obviously has raised, as Alonso was mentioning, and he used very many examples, has raised privacy and human rights concerns, because that technology can potentially be used for surveillance. And I think civil society organizations in Panama have been working on this. Alonso also looked at China's influence in Panama's law enforcement and policing, which includes a pending extradition treaty. Leland, do we have a sense as to whether that agreement has been signed, or is it still in the works?
It still has not been signed yet.
Okay. So there's a pending extradition treaty, which among other things allows deportation, of supposedly Chinese nationals that are wanted back in the PRC for one or other issue. This is important in this because we've seen a similar activity in Kenya, where there was a very controversial case, very public as well, where over 150 Taiwanese and mainland Chinese were apprehended and relocated to PRC territory in violation of a high court injunction that prevented the Kenya government from doing this. But nevertheless, the deportations took place. And when these individuals landed in the PRC, they all received very, very stiff sentences for allegedly engaging in illicit activity involving telecommunications. So we have seen this sort of activity increase in a number of African countries. I mean, at the beginning of last year, for instance, and one of the issues that was discussed in this particular session, we saw a joint operation of Chinese and Ugandan police commandos. This was an operation that took place on Ugandan territory to apprehend suspected Chinese members of a Chinese criminal gang, criminal networks. These individuals were pursued. Some of them were apprehended on Ugandan territory, but then others escaped into the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's not clear whether that operation continued into the DRC. We've seen similar operations in Angola, in Mozambique. I mean, Mozambique also has a similar security and emergency operations center equipped with similar technology. Kenya, the Kenya police also has a similar system, and many other African countries, Angola, to name a few, have also procured these sorts of technologies. So it's increasing, it's growing. I mean, 10 years ago, China did not have a single extradition or deportation agreement with any African country. That situation has changed rapidly, and especially after the Belt and Road initiatives got underway in 2012 and 2013. So again, the issues that Alonso mentioned, the concerns that he mentioned, have also been raised by a number of African human rights and civil society organizations. Then Arhin Akiampong, who's from the Afro-Sino Center for International Relations in Ghana, underscored a number of concerns associated with Chinese-linked criminal groups and data access via cybersecurity collaborations that could compromise, public safety and security. Arhin's presentation also drew parallels with Africa, where China's influence has grown tremendously, and I've done a lot of work on this on the police and law enforcement side, and also in terms of Chinese private firms. Just for lack of a better word, because they're not really private, but consisting of ex People's Liberation Army and ex Special Forces and Chinese People's Armed Police, that have been active in a number of Belt and Road projects in Kenya, in Somalia, in Ghana, in Nigeria, and in many other African countries. We see that China is increasingly starting to rely on the services of these firms, and that does raise a number of concerns, which were discussed in the panel, which is how does one ensure standards of safety and security? There have been instances where Chinese guards have injured local persons. There was a high-level case in Zimbabwe involving a son of a prominent parliamentarian. There've been cases in Zambia. There've been cases in South Africa, and so on. So this is emerging as an area of concern. One of the things that the panel identified is the need for closer collaboration between African, Latin American, and Caribbean actors involved in enhancing democratic governance, transparency, human rights protection in police and law enforcement. This is important because law enforcement is one of those areas where citizens, and the security forces are interacting intensively on a daily basis. So it becomes absolutely critical. I was in Beijing in September on the margins of the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, and I had an opportunity of engaging Chinese scholars and also the Chinese government around some of these issues. And what came out of those engagements were one of the key takeaways of those engagements is that the Chinese side is really looking to strengthen police and law enforcement engagement, as well as security firms. So I think this is something that both regions, Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa, are likely to see an uptick over the next 3 to 4 years. The other session looked at emerging technology. It examined China's advancements in AI, cybersecurity, space exploration. There are quite a number of space-related projects, Chinese space-related projects, some of which are run by PLA entities in Africa and Latin American countries. There are policy implications for African and Latin American countries. Dr. Johnson, Donovan Johnson from Florida International University, as well as Major General John Wharton from the same university, and Dr. Myandu Piwakule from Howard University, really unpacked Chinese engagements in those sectors and in those various regions. Cybersecurity and AI, these are national priorities, as we all know, by the Chinese Communist Party. China's willingness to prioritize national security, and in particular domestic security and regime survival, is well known, and this mirrors and is reflected in the sorts of engagements, the sorts of security engagements that China has been engaging with, the People's Republic of China has been engaging with on the African continent and in other parts of the world. So a number of proposals came out, including a recommendation that countries should align their AI and cybersecurity standards with global norms. The number of global norms that have come into play in recent years. And the discussion also addressed the concept of digital sovereignty being a central goal for the PRC, that basically seeks to exert control over digital information, both within China's borders and in countries that partner with China. And as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese model of international engagements effectively looks at and basically emphasizes the entrenchment of regime security. So what would normally be looked at as national security threats from a democratic standpoint, from a PRC standpoint, opposition to government policy itself can constitute a national security threat. That would then invite the use of the coercive machinery. Unfortunately, quite a number of African and Latin American countries also adhere, or rather employ similar concepts of national security, right, which then creates avenues for a common language of public security between China and these various countries. And so these are some of the issues that were discussed. So lots of concerns. The forum highlighted the need for ethical AI that emphasizes the notion of whoever controls the data will be king, underscoring the importance of data sovereignty and control. In conclusion, the participants called for African, Latin American, Caribbean nations to strategically invest in technological education, regulatory frameworks, and multilateral partnerships to safeguard against over-reliance on any single foreign power for critical technological infrastructure. Then there was the final session was on disinformation and media, which explored China's influence on global media narratives and disinformation narratives. There were quite a few panelists: Margaret Myers from Inter-American Dialogue, Maria Montt from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, the Catholic University in Chile, Parcival de Sola from the Andres Bello Foundation, and Dr. Henry Dube from the University of Pretoria. And these colleagues discussed how China tailors its international messaging, strategically translating phrases to avoid political connotations and present itself as a fellow friendly developing nation. This approach is supported by China's domestic network of international communication centers. Again, Kenya is among a number of African countries that host some fairly robust Chinese media and communications infrastructure to promote favorable narratives globally. This is something that the Chinese Communist Party has prioritized in its strategic framing. In the African continent, the Chinese media architecture has been around for a very long time, dating back to the 1950s. If one looks at the establishment of Xinhua, the establishment of Radio China in a number of African countries, Algeria, Egypt, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the former Zaire, and many other places. And what we have seen on the Africa side is a gradual shift from seeing Chinese faces that are delivering these messages. These messages are now being delivered by African faces, by professional African, some of whom are really veterans in the sector. So we've seen a shift in that particular regard. This is definitely key in the larger architecture of Chinese engagements in the global South, because the global South is a region that China is really doubling down and engaging quite aggressively in the context of a growing strategic competition. And so selling China's message, delivering China's message, has become absolutely key. The whole concept of Huayu Quan, which is something that the Chinese Communist Party has identified as a major investment going forward. And that has also spilled over into the social media space. And it was very interesting in this panel. Panelists observed that much as entities like Twitter are banned on Chinese platforms, the Chinese diplomats are using it effectively to engage on a number of issues and in a number of countries. Quite a number of tactics that the PRC is using: content sharing agreements, supply of hardware, media hardware, training of journalists and editors. There's this program that's run out of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where African and Asian senior editors get to go on extended 12-month fellowships in China, where they work in Chinese newsrooms and cover important CCP events and so on. The Belt and Road Media Network, which has grown, the Belt and Road News Network that has grown over the years, and so China is making a serious effort. And of course, that also comes with a number of issues and a number of concerns that many African and Latin American colleagues have identified in terms of journalistic practices, in terms of media independence, and so on. So I think I'll stop there. This is a summary of this very important forum, and Leland shared some material as I was speaking, and the forum is going to continue to try and have a comprehensive look at how Chinese entities are engaging across the global south, and in particular these three sub-regions. So thank you very much.
Summit, and I think you were very right in most of your assumptions. So what we saw from this year's FOCAC is that the kind of engagement that China wants to do with African countries in the next 5 years tends to tilt towards the social, or what others would call soft, not the physical infrastructure as such. Like you've mentioned, a lot of it would have to do with military aid, police trainings and exchanges. While there would still be, of course, the physical and of course the very obvious, trade, infrastructure. But I think, in my opinion, I would say that the engagement is becoming more complex and also very difficult to measure. Why? Because security in our own countries are, they're almost taboo. We rarely talk about them, and it's very hard for us to even access information regarding security. And now there's, China is also big on media, again, another very sensitive tool that is used in most governments, which are unfortunately not perfect democracies. So what do you make of this shift in the relationship? While China says, it's people to people, but I see it as the people are actually military in nature, and it's security. It's not really the grassroots people as such. And how are we going to even access information regarding China-Africa engagements when a lot of it is to do with security, and we can't access those information as always? And finally, before you came to the stage, there was a question that was raised to me during my presentation about safety, because people know for sure that it's very difficult to access information on Chinese-funded projects. Now, when it comes to security, how do you always do your things? Because you publish so much around security. Maybe that question might help the previous person who asked. Thank you.
Okay, so Paul or Leland, who would like to answer this? Oh, sorry, Paul, you are muted. We cannot hear you.
Right. Leland, do you want to go first? Or okay. All right. Look, those are great questions. And I have to confess that it is very difficult. It's very difficult to operate in the Chinese security and military space. It's not easy. And that's the reason why expertise on the People's Liberation Army and China's other armed forces is very thin. It's very thin. So you're going to tend to read analyses, public analyses, and public assessments will generally be from the same people over time. And there's even less engagement, discussion, and policy debate and media debate on Chinese military engagements in Africa. There's very little, there's just really a handful. You can count the number of experts that deal with this issue on one hand. It's a difficult space. And I think it's made more difficult by the fact that Africa tends to be seen as a low priority. And so, for instance, sort of Africa-China issues tend to be lower on the list of high-level engagements compared to things like, militarization in the South China Sea, the potential for military action against Taiwan, China's nuclear modernization, and things of that nature. Those are the sorts of things that will occupy the day-to-day desk with the day-to-day priorities of a Western or an American diplomat in Beijing. So the issues of Africa engagement are really not going to be that significant. So it becomes very, very difficult, right, to track these issues. On the eve of the FOCAC summit, the Tanzanian and Chinese militaries engaged in what was China's largest and most consequential military exercise since 2000, where we saw the transport of major Chinese armaments and units from mainland China into Africa for the first time, because usually PLA contingents in Chinese military exercises in Africa will usually come from the naval base in Djibouti, or will already be in theater conducting anti-piracy patrols. But for the first time, these units came from mainland China. So China was basically demonstrating the development of its expeditionary capabilities. This was hardly mentioned in the African media. There was maybe one or two reports in the US media. I was monitoring it very closely because I was on my way to Beijing, and there was literally no discussion about any of this. The fact that the PLA, the largest PLA deployment in the world since 2005, is on the African continent. The Chinese military maintains continuously deployed flotillas in the Indian Ocean, has deployed submarines, has deployed advanced capabilities, frigates, frigates, and destroyers, engaging in these operations. So, counter-piracy sounds very benign, But when you talk to Chinese military experts, they will tell you that they see these as military operations that are aimed at developing China's military capabilities. Unfortunately, the discussion on these issues is very, very limited in the African press and in the global press. So I think that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is, because there's such little public reporting on it, it's very difficult to get that information. And it's very difficult to make empirical judgments and empirical assessments. I think that's the first problem of being of working in this space. Secondly, language. Lots of there's a real value in learning Chinese. There's a real value, and one learned that early on, because that affords one the ability to have access to documents, to have access to, because there's a lot of meaning. There's a lot of meaning and a lot of nuance in Chinese policy documents that really doesn't come out it really doesn't come out if one doesn't invest in heavily in learning Chinese. So I think what Leland was talking about earlier on is extremely important. Part of the problem is this lack of facility with Chinese. And then I think the third issue is, as you say correctly, national security. There's a wall around national security issues, and definitely even on the African continent, there's some countries where media personalities cannot discuss even military issues. Things like a military budget, military procurement cannot be discussed openly. I mean, in some countries that earns you serious offenses and serious time in jail, right? So when we look at how the Chinese state is structured, right? In the Chinese state, you find a similar orientation, namely that national security issues, which have to do with regime survival and the survival of the Chinese Communist Party, these are taboo, publicly, right? So I think these are some of the difficulties. But having said that, there are quite a number of things One is, essentially tracking on a day-to-day basis, because the Chinese press does advertise China's military capabilities, and that is done for strategic communication purposes. So, for instance, the activities in Tanzania, videos were released, statement after statement came out of the Chinese military press, and so on. Basically, itemizing those, having an archive, looking at the commitments. So, for instance, there were commitments in FOCAC, right? Announcements were made, and there have been quite a number of activities that have happened, right, since the FOCAC summit has been held. So, itemizing those on a sometimes even on a daily basis, just having a spreadsheet, looking at all these different activities, looking at how they're being reported in the Chinese press, collaborating with networks, right? Right now, there are growing networks in Latin America and in the Caribbean and on the African continent, networks of scholars that are sharing information, that are tracking Chinese initiatives closely, that are tracking Chinese policies, right? Groups like the Chinese in Africa and Africans in China Research Network. I think that group has over 600 independent scholars, right, that are looking at different aspects of Chinese engagement, including military engagement. And you have similar activity. The forum that Leland and I have been participating in, for instance, is an example of that. So I think there are many different ways in which some of those silos can be broken down, and some of that information can be accessed, at least publicly. And then you see the beauty of publishing publicly and engaging in public commentary is that if governments feel that they're being misrepresented, or that we've gotten things wrong, then the onus is on them to provide data. And once that data is provided, it then helps the conversation, right? So this is just basically a long-winded answer to basically make the case that there are ways in which this wall around national security issues, these walls can actually be broken down, but it requires systematic engagement, and there are certain methodologies that are involved, right? the China Africa Research Institute out at Johns Hopkins convenes young and emerging African scholars that are interested in covering China to basically learn from more experienced analysts, more experienced commentators, to look at the methodologies and tools that might be used to get better insight into these issues. But for me, as a Chinese security scholar and analyst, the biggest stumbling block that I have seen over the years in which I've been covering the Chinese military is there's simply no public information out there, even by very experienced journalists. There's just very little discussion on what the PLA is doing and what the Chinese People's Armed Police is doing. The Chinese People's Armed Police is very engaged in a number of African countries, agreements being signed all the time, but there's very, very, very little reporting on that. So I think that's something that has to change.
And we can only have one Q&A questions. Very pity. So Paul and Leland, for next time, if you have chance to join us physically, I believe that there will be more exchanges with you and the participants. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.